Hello and welcome to Wild Earth Ways. I'm Kat, and in today's video I'm going to be exploring tarot and storytelling. So I'm going to share some decks which I think are really great storytellers, and also look a little bit more widely at how tarot tells stories and the kind of storytelling that takes place with the tarot, because I feel that this is really at the heart of what we do with tarot. We use the cards to evoke stories, to think about the stories we are telling with our lives and the stories that we want to tell with our lives. And also, in addition to that, tarot is a fantastic tool for the imagination. So it stirs up different ideas and stories in a really evocative way. So I'm going to take a look at some decks that do this beautifully. So first of all, I think I have to start with the classic storytelling deck, which is of course the Rider-Waite-Smith. This is what first drew me to tarot, what first interested me about tarot. When I got my first Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was not this one. This one wasn't out at that time. This is the Centennial. But I was interested in the tarot as a sort of machine for creating stories, and I found the images incredibly evocative. I wasn't at that time interested in spirituality or self-development. I just was intrigued by the tarot as a kind of system for storytelling. So that includes the major arcana, but perhaps less so than the minor arcana. So in the major arcana, we see these quite static images of different archetypes. And lots of people have explored how the major arcana come together to create a story as we move through them. So the Fool's journey through the archetypes. And this is interesting, but I think what really intrigued me about the tarot were actually the images in the minor arcana. So I'm looking for the swords, because the swords perhaps in particular. This image of the Two of Swords is so evocative of a story. It's so mysterious. Why is this woman sitting on the edge of the water with these two crossed swords, blindfolded? What does this mean? And what's been happening? Or another card I really enjoy, this Six of Swords. It really stirs up lots of questions. Who are these people? What are they fleeing from? Or what are they seeking to find? And what will happen to them? What are they carrying with them in the boat? I think the minor arcana are incredible artworks by Pixie, in the sense that they invite us to tell stories. They evoke different stories which are so open-ended and invite the reader in to take it in whichever direction makes sense to us. This is not to say that we can only tell stories with illustrated pips like in the Rider-Waite-Smith. Clearly also in Marseille or other pip style decks, you can also create stories. And shortly after I got my first Rider-Waite-Smith deck, I read this book, The Castle of Crossed Destinies by Italo Calvino. So Italo Calvino was a great Italian novelist in the 20th century, and he wrote lots of experimental novels. And this one, The Castle of Crossed Destiny, is a collection of short stories woven together using the tarot. So The Castle of Crossed Destinies is inspired by the Visconti Sforza deck, and he actually created a kind of grid using the tarot deck, and he then told the stories of the columns, and he told the stories of the rows, both forwards and backwards, with different characters. So each kind of line has a different protagonist. And the stories overlap, but actually the cards have different significations in the different stories. So characters can show up in different ways in the different stories. And some of the stories are original to Calvino, and some he based on well-known stories like Greek myths or Hamlet or medieval romances, all pop up in his story. And it's a fascinating book. It's not Calvino's greatest book. He wrote many really fantastic novels. So if you've never come across him before, I will just share a couple of them because I think he's a really interesting writer. So this one, Our Ancestors, is a collection of novels set in a kind of medieval world, but each one is inspired by a very strong image. So the Cloven Viscount is about a knight who's been split in two. Both sides of him go on living in different ways. The Baron in the Trees is about a young nobleman who goes up into the trees and then lives his entire life without coming down to the ground. And the non-existent knight, this is about a knight. He's killed in a war, and then his suit of armour returns and sort of refuses to accept that it's empty, and continues to try to live his life, even though it's actually an empty suit of armour. Other great books by Italo Calvino, there's this one, Invisible Cities, which is a kind of travelogue through different imaginary cities which embody different concepts. And this one, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller, which is made up of first chapters of different stories in different genres, all strung together. So you can see Calvino was someone who's just obsessed with story. He was obsessed with experimenting with story and so incredibly creative at doing so. And he was drawn to tarot because that's what tarot does. And he actually created two sets of stories. So the first one is based on the Visconti Sforza, and the second collection is based on the Tarot de Marseille, and it's actually called the Tavern of Crossed Destinies. So he has a kind of aristocratic set of stories and then a more popular set of stories. And in each of them, what happens at the beginning is a group of people meet in a castle or in a tavern, and they can no longer speak. Their voices have gone. And they want to tell the stories of their lives, of what has brought them here. And they have a tarot deck. And that's by arranging the cards on the table, they're able to evoke the stories of their lives. So the narrator is interpreting the stories as he sees them laid out by the other characters and as he sets out his story as well. At the end of the book, there's a note by Calvino in which he explains about it. He explains about what tarot is. And he writes, "I published this book to be free of it. It has obsessed me for years. I began by trying to line up tarots at random to see if I could read a story in them. The Waverer's Tale emerged. I started writing it down. I looked for other combinations of the same cards. I realized the tarots were a machine for constructing stories. I thought of a book and I imagined its frame, the mute narrators, the forest, the inn. I was tempted by the diabolical idea of conjuring up all the stories that could be contained in a tarot deck. I thought of constructing a kind of crossword puzzle made of tarots instead of letters, of pictographic stories instead of words. I wanted each of the stories to have a coherent significance, and I wanted them to afford me pleasure in writing them or in rewriting them if they were already classic stories." And he goes on, "I spent whole days taking apart and putting together my puzzle. I invented new rules for the game. I drew hundreds of patterns. In a square, I rhomboid a star design. But some essential cards were always left out." And he goes on to explain how he continued over years trying to explore these different possibilities. And finally, he comes up with this one. And you can see that he's not completely satisfied with it, but it's the best that he was able to do. And it's this story of Calvino putting together these different tales is so fascinating to me, because it tells us, I think, about the nature of storytelling and the nature of tarot, how it's something that's going on and on. There's no end to it, and it's always kind of crossing and intercrossing with itself. And so when we read with the tarot, I feel that like we are creating these stories anew, but we're also connecting back to all the stories that have been told already. So inspired by Calvino, I thought I would share some of my favorite storytelling decks, because I find it fascinating how the tarot is telling like the same stories over and over, and showing how when you put them together in different ways, you always have something new and something that is telling us what we haven't already heard before. So I've already talked about the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I think that many great storytelling decks are essentially based on the Rider-Waite-Smith. So if not clones, then copying it for the most part. And so the example I have here is the Druidcraft, which I think is a good example of this. It's obviously based very closely on the Rider-Waite-Smith, but it also tells its own stories, and it creates a sort of coherent world in which we can see these stories taking place. So the Druidcraft is a nice example of a deck which is inspired by the stories of the Rider-Waite-Smith and puts them into a new world that brings a whole new perspective. And when you read with this deck, it's like taking a journey through a kind of historical or fantasy novel with these different characters having these different experiences. So I enjoy this as very evocative of stories in a different world than the Rider-Waite-Smith world. Another deck that sort of similarly is based on Rider-Waite-Smith structure, but transforms the stories, is this one, the Tarot of the Abyss by Anna Turian. And I think that her art, Anna Turian's art, is incredibly evocative of story. Like here, it's so simple, the Four of Swords, these four swords leaning against the wall and the helmet that's been taken off. But it invites you to think about what's happened, you know, what battle has occurred, and what has happened to the people who carried those swords. This Nine of Wands, equally, this very battle-weary person leaning against this palisade. They feel like illustrations for a story, a novel, and yet they're also very open and invite us in to create our own stories out of these situations. In particular, I think the court cards are really special in this deck. So I pulled out the wands, because the court cards in this deck always tell a story progressively. So here we can see the Page of Wands collecting sticks to start a fire. And here's the Knight of Wands, who has found a kind of fire spirit. And we can see the page in the background of this image. And here's the Queen of Wands, who's taken these sticks and fire spirit and started to create this fire. And here's the King of Wands, who's releasing the full potential of the fire. It's really special. I do have some reservations about this deck. I find it to be a very good reader, but I also find it to be a little bit cold, and I was thinking about why that might be. And I realized that one of the reasons is the way in which relationships are portrayed in the deck. So I particularly don't like this Lovers card of two trees. I love trees, so it's not the trees that are the problem, it's the fact that they have no leaves. They could be dead. Obviously it's black and white, so it's a little bit difficult to know, but I feel that, yeah, these trees look dead to me. And so as a lover's card, I find this quite depressing. And also this Ten of Cups card, where the characters are held at arm's length. I don't see the closeness that I would like to see in a Ten of Cups in this image. It's very evocative of story, because I'm asking myself, is she pulling us towards the home, or am I pulling her away from it? It's not clear to me what's happening, and it could be different according to different readings. So by contrast, I do have another black and white deck, which is also based on the RWS, which is the Bianco Nero. And on the whole, I do, I suppose, prefer the Tarot of the Abyss. I mean, it's difficult to make comparisons, but in terms of storytelling, I think Tarot of the Abyss is incredible. But in terms, I did dig out these cards because I was thinking about what are my issues with the Tarot of the Abyss. Like, this is the Ten of Cups in the Bianco Nero, and I love the closeness of this couple in this image. It really feels like an image of love and togetherness. And then this is the Lover's card in the Bianco Nero. So you can see a completely different energy in this card, and an image of closeness and passion and love, which I don't see in these trees. So it's both of them are great decks for telling stories, though, for sure. So it's interesting to see how different decks can tell very different stories using the same inspiration. So both decks are inspired by the Rider-Waite-Smith, and by the tarot system. So, but still can tell a very different story with a card like the Ten of Cups, one to the other. So the next deck I thought about for telling stories is this one, which is Tarot of the Divine. This deck each card is based on a different folktale from around the world. And some of them are familiar and some of them are less familiar to me. So I did also get this book, Beneath the Moon, which is by Yoshitani. And in it, they've got full illustrations of the cards and also very short tellings of the stories. So the stories which are told are just like this, one page. And I actually quite appreciate this because the stories are told so briefly. It gives you a lot of space around the images to sort of think about the meanings of the stories and to build up the details in your imagination. And according to the story that your reading is giving you. I do find this deck is a fantastic reader. It gives really interesting insights into the questions that I've brought to it. I love this image of the Eight of Coins. In this folktale, this woman, her 8 brothers were turned into swans. And she was given the task of weaving shirts for them from nettles. And while she was doing this task, she was not able to speak and not able to say a word until the task was complete. And then when she would give them the nettle shirts, they would transform back into humans. And the way that Yoshitani has interpreted it, she has the woman creating pentacles from thorns. So it's a really interesting image of dedication to a practice, which is hard, but that is ultimately going to be incredibly fulfilling and important. So every image has a fascinating story, and it really brings different insights into the kind of classic Rider-Waite-Smith interpretations. And I love really everything about this deck. I love the diversity of the figures. I love its kind of optimistic spirit. So even in images which are distressing, there's still a kind of creative potential. And I feel like, this card is a good example of this, actually, because Ten of Swords is horrific. And this particular story, this moment in the story of Sedna, is a horrific moment where this woman who has been married to a man who was concealing who he truly was. So he came in marriage to Sedna. This is an Inuit story. I can't remember exactly where it's from. But in the story, the woman Sedna marries a man who takes her to his home, and he turns out to be a cormorant or another kind of seabird in different versions of the stories. And she's unhappy and she tries to return home. But when she's in her father's boat, a great storm is stirred up because her husband was a kind of powerful spirit. And her father throws her into the ocean. And when she tries to climb back into the boat, he cuts off her fingers so that she can't get in. And she sinks into the ocean. And then she transforms into an ocean goddess. And from her come many, many different sea creatures, different animals that live in the oceans. So from her pain and despair in this image of the Ten of Swords comes this phenomenal creative energy, which transforms the environment. So she actually becomes then revered by the people as somebody who can bring them bounty, successful hunting, and is considered to be a kind of a powerful protective or destructive force in the ocean. So each of these cards has amazing stories behind it. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's very inspiring to work with this deck. So the next one I thought of is as a tarot that tells stories is this one, the John Bauer Tarot. So this is a deck which was created out of pre-existing art. John Bauer was a storybook illustrator, an artist. Each card takes you into this world of Swedish folktale, and you're inspired as you read to imagine what's happening and what is going to happen in each of these images. So this here, look at this amazing image for the Hierophant. I completely love it, where these two children are meeting this stone troll figure. He looks quite friendly though. I think he's quite a friendly looking troll, the Hierophant troll. And I know that there is a collection of Swedish folktales illustrated by John Bauer, which is available. And I have held off buying it because at the moment when I read with this deck, it inspires me in a way that I feel like I'm stepping into the unknown. I'm stepping into these stories. I don't know the stories that they connect to, that Bauer was illustrating. And so it's up to me to create my own story, to make sense of why this little girl with a crown is kissing the nose of this enormous bear. I adore this image of the Queen of Swords looking at these swans. It makes me think of all those stories with swan shapeshifters and this kind of expression of yearning and peacefulness at the same time in her face is so beautiful. This deck actually also has one of my favorite Kings of Swords. I don't know if I'm going to come across it. I cannot stand this Knight of Pentacles. It's the one problem I have with this deck, is that for me is so wrong, and that should be a different card, but I have to just cope with it. Look at this amazing Magician, which is a troll with 3 birds on his back. I'm not sure what exactly they are because they have this hooked beak, so they can't be crows, I don't think. They look in shape like kind of vultures, but I'm not exactly sure what bird that is. I love this chariot. as well. Each of these cards evokes a story so strongly that for now I haven't sought out the book of the collection so that I can kind of enter into my own story world when I'm reading with this deck, with this kind of underwater figure crowning this blindfolded woman. There's so much beauty and inspiration in these cards. Another deck which I think brings similar kind of beautiful, inspiring storytelling vibes is the Shadowscapes. Now, I've mentioned this one quite a few times already, even in the few videos I've created on this channel, because the Shadowscapes is one of my favorite decks. I feel like when reading with this book, with this deck, it's like stepping into another world, and that the cards, when put together, create stories. And I've used this as inspiration for creative writing, not directly, not like writing about this world directly, but I feel that it's a very creative deck. It's inviting you all the time to kind of step into your imagination and to find the beauty in your imagination. So that's the Shadowscapes, the Tarot, Shadowscapes Tarot by Stephanie Law. And I have one last deck to share for storytelling, which is a deck which I haven't yet used, but I bought it because I thought it was bringing a new approach to storytelling in tarot, and that's the Pagan Otherworlds. So I got this deck last year, at the end of the year, and haven't yet used it. I'm a little bit hesitant about it, to be honest. I have a few doubts about it, which I have to kind of work through and see how it works in practice. Now, the reason I got this deck was because I thought that I particularly like the minors, because in the minors it feels like you yourself are stepping into the scene. So you yourself are part of the story that's being told. You can walk between these two wands. You could take this wand, perhaps. You're looking at the ships. You can walk under this garland and up to the castle. And so it really gives a sense of stepping into the story yourself, which I do find very intriguing, and I'm looking forward to working with it. And I want to use it specifically for storytelling. My hesitation about the deck really has to do with the I don't know if I can find an example. Well, this is an example. It has to do with the animal skins. I don't like seeing so many animal skins in the images, but what I'm thinking is that I can rationalize it in my mind that the characters are shapeshifters. So this Queen of Cups, for example, could be a Selkie who has taken off her skin to transform to human shape, but the seal skin is her skin, and she can put it back on to transform back into a seal shape. So that's how I'm working with the animal skins in this deck, which are otherwise causing me a little bit of hesitation about stepping into this world. But I do think that the Pagan Otherworlds looks to me like a deck that tells powerful stories. I love this Two of Swords, for example, which really invites you to be the figure who sits at the edge of the water holding the two crossed swords, and asks you, what's the story that you're creating from this situation? Because ultimately that's what storytelling in the tarot is about. It's about asking questions about the stories we're making with our own lives. Are we doing everything we can to tell the best stories, to tell the stories that we most want to tell for ourselves and for the people who we're interacting with, for the world around us, and for our own kind of soul's journey in life. And that's what fascinates me about the tarot's storytelling, is how it invites us to step into that practice. So thanks very much for joining me for this video about storytelling in the tarot. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this. Do you have decks that you find particularly evocative for telling stories? Which decks are they? And what kind of stories are they telling? And if you have enjoyed the video, it would mean a lot to me if you would like and subscribe. I'm just starting out here on YouTube, so every time I get a new subscriber, it's very exciting for me, and I'm very happy to see that my videos are connecting with people. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.